It is the winter of 1942. The world is locked in conflict, and the map of civilization itself seems to be burning. Across Europe, cities are reduced to rubble. In the Pacific, islands once unknown to most Americans become the names of bloody battlefields. Soldiers fight not only against enemies they can see, but against confusion, distance, and the unforgiving terrain that surrounds them. In such a vast and unpredictable war, victory often depends on knowing the unseen, on mastering the geography that determines life or death. Inside a dimly lit room beneath the US Army Corps of Engineers in Washington, D.C., the air hums with quiet urgency. Tables are covered in layers of paper, charts, and rulers. Men and women bend over them with pencils and magnifying glasses, tracing coastlines and marking symbols that few outside their walls will ever understand. These are not generals or soldiers, but cartographers, mapmakers who fight their own kind of war. Every stroke of ink they lay down could decide the fate of a mission thousands of miles away. In an era when intelligence was power, these secret maps became America's invisible weapon. At the same time, across the ocean, Axis armies moved with terrifying speed. The Nazi blitzkrieg rolled across Europe while Japanese forces captured islands one by one. Their progress was relentless, leaving behind a sense that the world itself was shrinking under occupation. The Allies needed more than courage. They needed vision. They needed to see the enemy's world without stepping into it. Out of that desperate necessity came a new idea: to turn the art of mapmaking into an exact science of war. Imagine being a young American pilot over the Pacific, staring down at a vast expanse of endless blue. Beneath the wings of your aircraft, there is nothing but waves, clouds, and the occasional shadow of an island that may or may not be friendly. Your life depends on the accuracy of the chart folded in your lap. One wrong calculation, one missing coordinate, and you vanish without a trace. That was the grim reality for thousands who took to the skies. But thanks to secret maps created far from the front lines, many of them would find their way home again. In those early years of the war, secrecy was everything. The American military realized that information could no longer be trusted to chance. Each map was classified, printed in limited numbers, and distributed by hand. Even commanders often received only fragments of the full picture. The less anyone knew, the safer the mission. But within that secrecy lay an extraordinary collaboration between science, art, and courage. For the first time in modern warfare, maps would not just record the world, they would create it. In the quiet of those underground rooms, the stakes were as high as in any battlefield. A misplaced river, a misjudged coastline could doom an entire invasion. Yet, through sleepless nights and long hours of concentration, the mapmakers continued. They studied aerial photos, intercepted radio signals, and pieced together fragments of data that the enemy thought were invisible. They worked not for glory or recognition, but for precision. Their world was measured in inches, but their influence reached across oceans. As 1943 approached, their work began to bear fruit. Secret charts guided convoys through the Atlantic, avoiding deadly U-boat traps. Hidden grids allowed bomber pilots to find targets deep in enemy territory. In every corner of the conflict, the Allies began to move with a new kind of confidence, a quiet assurance born not from chance, but from preparation. For the first time, the Axis war machine faced an opponent that could outthink it. The story of these secret maps begins in these shadowed rooms, where minds worked faster than bombs could fall. It is a story of intellect versus aggression, of knowledge forged in the darkness to bring light to a world at war. Every map, every coded line, carried not just data, but the heartbeat of those who believed that the truth of the land could win the battle for freedom. And though the war would rage for years to come, the foundation for victory had already been drawn, quietly, precisely, on paper. By the spring of 1943, the war had become a contest not only of strength, but of intellect. On one side stood the Axis powers, whose rapid conquests were fueled by confidence and momentum. Their armies advanced across Europe and Asia with mechanical precision, trusting in speed, fear, and the element of surprise. On the other stood the Allied nations, still recovering from early losses, learning to fight in a world remade by technology and deception. To the Axis generals, maps were tools of conquest, static, utilitarian, and often discarded once the next territory fell. To the Americans, however, maps were becoming something more. They were alive, changing with each new piece of intelligence, reflecting the rhythm of war itself. In many ways, this difference defined the very spirit of the two sides. The Axis trusted experience and instinct, believing their armies invincible. Their maps were filled with the confidence of domination, drawn from previous victories rather than current reality. American strategists saw the danger in such arrogance. They understood that modern war could not be won through pride alone, but through precision. Each secret map created by Allied intelligence became a small act of defiance, a refusal to let the enemy's momentum dictate the outcome of the war. Imagine standing in a command tent in North Africa, the desert winds howling outside. A young American officer unrolls a chart on the table, its surface marked with coded colors and faint pencil lines. Across from him, a British counterpart studies the document in silence. Together, they trace a line that represents a possible advance. A path invisible to the enemy, but carved from hours of aerial observation and intercepted signals. Outside, the Axis tanks wait, unaware that the sands beneath them have already been mapped, studied, and turned into a trap. In that tent, the battle of wits begins long before the first shot is fired. This contrast was not only strategic, but cultural. The Axis powers glorified decisive action, while the Americans began to glorify deliberate calculation. Where one side favored instinct, the other leaned on data. German and Japanese commanders often relied on human scouts or traditional reconnaissance, while the Allies invested in aerial photography, satellite precursors, and coded geographic systems. The Americans treated geography not as a backdrop, but as a living ally. Every valley, coastline, and forest could be understood, predicted, and used. Even within the Allied ranks, the transformation was difficult. Many field officers resisted relying too heavily on paper intelligence, believing that maps could never replace human judgment. But over time, victories began to silence the doubts. When a convoy successfully navigated treacherous waters, or when a paratrooper landed precisely where he was meant to, confidence in the maps grew. The old ways of intuition gave way to a new trust in science and collaboration. What had once been dismissed as academic suddenly became vital to survival. Across the Atlantic, this quiet revolution continued to unfold. In hidden intelligence centers, American analysts worked side by side with mathematicians, engineers, and codebreakers. They layered their findings like puzzle pieces, building maps that revealed not only geography, but intent. The contrast between Axis aggression and Allied calculation grew sharper with each passing month. While one side relied on brute force, the other was learning to fight a war of the mind. By 1944, this difference began to manifest on the battlefield in ways the Axis could not have foreseen. German commanders who once believed their flanks secure found Allied forces emerging from unexpected directions. Japanese pilots who relied on familiar island routes suddenly found themselves ambushed by forces that seemed to know the seas better than they did. The illusion of control began to slip away. Behind these reversals lay the quiet, tireless work of cartographers and intelligence officers who had dared to think differently. The war's contrast was no longer simply between nations, but between philosophies. The Axis sought dominance through destruction, while the Allies pursued victory through understanding. It was a collision between arrogance and adaptation, between instinct and intellect. And in that collision, the secret maps of America became symbols of a new kind of power. They proved that knowledge could outmaneuver might, that foresight could defeat fury. The age of blind conquest was ending, and a new era of strategic warfare was being drawn, one precise line at a time. Long before the thunder of artillery shook the battlefields of Europe, the war of maps had already begun in silence. In early 1941, as the Axis powers expanded their reach, a quiet mobilization took shape across the United States. In dimly lit rooms beneath universities, government buildings, and makeshift offices, a network of cartographers, engineers, and intelligence officers began their work. They were not soldiers in the traditional sense, but their mission was just as vital. Theirs was a war fought with pencils, rulers, and magnifying glasses, where accuracy meant survival. Every coastline, mountain ridge, and river crossing had to be known before a single soldier could step foot upon it. The origins of America's secret maps lay in the collaboration between the military and civilian scientists. The US Army Corps of Engineers, the Office of Strategic Services, and the Coast and Geodetic Survey pooled their expertise to create something unprecedented: a comprehensive cartographic intelligence network. Universities such as Harvard, Yale, and the University of California quietly contributed scholars who specialized in geography and topography. Many of them had never imagined their academic studies would serve a military purpose, yet the world had changed. In those tense years, lines on paper became weapons as powerful as guns. The task was enormous, but the goal was clear: to understand the world better than the enemy ever could. Inside these secret facilities, the process was painstaking. Aerial reconnaissance provided a bird's-eye view of occupied territories, while captured documents, ship logs, and even postcards from travelers offered precious geographic clues. Analysts combined these fragments into detailed maps that revealed hidden airfields, ammunition depots, and natural barriers. Each map was a mosaic of information gathered from 100 different sources. Mistakes could not be tolerated because a single wrong coordinate might send an entire division into disaster. The work demanded precision, patience, and an unwavering belief that knowledge could win the war. Imagine one of these rooms late at night. The sound of pencils scratching across paper echoes in the silence. Cigarette smoke curls upward in thin trails, blurring the light of desk lamps. A young woman from a New York university studies a set of aerial photographs, tracing the shadow of a ridge that might conceal an enemy base. Beside her, an army officer compares her findings with intercepted radio messages. Their work is meticulous, methodical, and unending. Outside, the city sleeps, unaware that inside this room, the landscape of future battles is being drawn. As the program grew, secrecy became its own weapon. Few outside the inner circle even knew such maps existed. They were printed in limited numbers, coded with complex markings, and hand-delivered to only the most trusted commanders. Sometimes, they were carried in locked cases chained to the wrist of an officer. Once used, many were destroyed to prevent capture. These maps were not merely classified, they were sacred. Within their folds lay the lifelines of thousands of soldiers, the routes to victory, and the boundaries of survival. Behind the creation of these maps was a philosophy that changed how war was fought. The Americans understood that geography was not static. It was dynamic, shifting with every battle and every discovery. By constantly updating their maps, they stayed ahead of the enemy's assumptions. This fluid understanding of terrain allowed them to plan invasions, supply routes, and air campaigns with unprecedented precision. Each update represented another move in an invisible chess game played across the globe. For the people who made them, the maps carried both pride and burden. Many of the cartographers never saw the front lines, yet they understood the human cost of every error. When reports arrived from the battlefield, victories or losses, they would gather around the radio, wondering if their maps had made the difference. Some would never know. Their work remained anonymous, their contributions buried beneath layers of classified history. But among them, there was a quiet conviction that their effort was shaping the war's outcome. By late 1943, the system they had built was unlike anything the world had seen. Thousands of maps had been produced, each tailored for specific missions. From the deserts of North Africa to the islands of the Pacific, American forces now marched, sailed, and flew guided by the unseen hands of these mapmakers. What began as an experiment had become a cornerstone of Allied strategy. The battlefield itself had been redrawn, and with it, the balance of power. These maps were not just depictions of land. They were instruments of liberation, crafted in secret, but destined to change the course of history. By 1943, the maps born in quiet rooms and guarded vaults had begun to shape the very rhythm of the war. For the first time, American commanders could visualize the battlefield in ways the Axis could not. In North Africa, where the desert stretched endlessly under a merciless sun, Allied forces advanced with uncanny precision. They avoided deep sand traps, navigated hidden wadis, and struck enemy supply routes with perfect timing. To the soldiers on the ground, it often seemed as though their leaders possessed a kind of foresight, an almost supernatural awareness of the enemy's movements. But that insight was not magic. It was the product of ink, geometry, and endless nights of analysis. Imagine standing in the heat of the Sahara, the sun burning against your skin, as the wind carries the sting of sand into your eyes. Around you, the roar of engines and the clatter of tank treads echo across the dunes. Amid that chaos, a young lieutenant pulls out a folded piece of paper from his jacket. The map is smudged, its edges worn, but it holds the key to survival. It shows the location of a ridge unseen to the naked eye, a natural cover that might mean the difference between life and death. The lieutenant gives the signal, and the convoy turns sharply, disappearing behind the shelter of the dunes. Minutes later, Axis artillery shells rain down on the open ground they just left. The map had saved them. Across the Atlantic, the Pacific Theater presented a different challenge. There, geography itself was an enemy. Dense jungles concealed traps and snipers, coral reefs destroyed landing craft, and storms turned navigation into a nightmare. American pilots often flew through miles of cloud and oceanic mist, relying entirely on their charts to find tiny islands scattered across the vast expanse. The secret maps created for them were unlike any the military had ever used before. They combined meteorological data, ocean currents, and coded symbols to reveal safe approaches and enemy fortifications. To a pilot lost over the endless blue, these maps were lifelines. Picture a bomber crew flying low over the Pacific, their engines straining against the humid air. The radio crackles with static as the navigator studies the chart spread before him. Every mark on that map represents a possibility: fuel reserves, wind direction, enemy radar positions. A single misreading could mean vanishing into the ocean. Yet thanks to the painstaking accuracy of those secret maps, the crew locates their target and delivers their payload with devastating precision. When they turn for home, they follow a line invisible to the enemy, but perfectly traced on paper back in Washington months before. In Europe, the same unseen influence guided some of the most decisive operations of the war. During reconnaissance flights over occupied France, Allied pilots used coded maps to identify rail lines, bridges, and troop formations that traditional intelligence could never locate. Each target was carefully plotted using multiple layers of geographic data, ensuring that every bomb dropped struck with purpose rather than chance. When paratroopers jumped behind enemy lines during the early stages of the D-Day invasion, their landing zones had been selected through months of cartographic study. The terrain was no longer unknown, it was mastered. The impact extended beyond logistics. These maps changed how soldiers thought about the world around them. Before, the landscape had been a source of danger and confusion. Now, it became a tool of empowerment. A mountain was no longer an obstacle, but a shield. A river crossing was not a gamble, but a calculation. Commanders could anticipate how the enemy would move, where they would retreat, and how to cut them off. The battlefield, once ruled by uncertainty, became a realm of strategy shaped by knowledge. Even the smallest details carried immense weight. Some maps included tiny notes about the texture of soil, the direction of wind currents, or the reflection of moonlight on water, information that could determine whether a night raid succeeded or failed. For the men who carried these maps, they were sacred objects, often tucked into breast pockets or sealed inside waterproof cases. Many soldiers would later recall how their trust in these folded pieces of paper gave them a sense of calm amid the chaos of war. The map was more than a guide. It was a promise that someone, somewhere, had thought of them. The Axis forces, accustomed to overwhelming their enemies through speed and shock, began to sense the shift. Their advances slowed as Allied troops anticipated their movements with uncanny precision. Supply lines were intercepted, hidden encampments discovered, and once secure positions encircled. It seemed as though the Allies were always one step ahead, always appearing where they were least expected. What the Axis could not see was that the war had already been charted against them. The battlefields were being redrawn, not by generals in the field, but by the quiet hands of those who had turned maps into weapons of victory. By the end of 1944, it was clear that these secret maps had altered the very nature of warfare. They had turned geography from an obstacle into an advantage, and knowledge into a weapon. Every inch of progress, every liberated town, and every successful operation bore the invisible mark of those who mapped the unseen. The war would still demand courage, sacrifice, and blood. But for the first time, American soldiers were not fighting blind. The land itself had become their ally, and the path to victory had been drawn long before they marched upon it. As the war entered its final years, the influence of America's secret maps reached far beyond individual battles. What began as a desperate effort to understand the terrain had evolved into a global network of intelligence and precision planning. The Allies were no longer merely reacting to Axis movements. They were predicting them. Every operation, from the smallest skirmish to the grandest invasion, was guided by the silent authority of these maps. They had transformed warfare into a science where every hill, forest, and coastline was not just known, but mastered. The old image of chaos on the battlefield was replaced by a calculated rhythm of strategy and control. The shift in military thinking was profound. Before the war, strategy had been built largely on intuition and experience. Commanders relied on scouts, rumors, and instinct. Now decisions were grounded in data. The Cartographic Intelligence Division had become as vital as the infantry or the Air Corps. The lines and grids that once seemed lifeless now held meaning far beyond their shape. They represented movement, supply, vulnerability, and hope. Commanders who once distrusted paper intelligence now depended on it as much as their rifles. With every operation that succeeded, faith in these maps grew stronger. This evolution brought a new sense of unity among the Allied forces. In the early years, coordination between armies had been difficult, slowed by distance and confusion. But shared maps gave them a common language. British, Canadian, and American officers could look at the same chart and understand instantly where their forces stood, how the terrain shaped their options, and where the enemy was likely to move. It eliminated guesswork and misunderstanding. Across continents, the Allies began to act as one, guided by a vision drawn in secret, yet understood universally. Imagine a dimly lit war room in London. On a vast table lies a map stretching from the beaches of Normandy to the heart of Germany. Tiny flags mark advancing divisions, supply routes, and newly liberated towns. Around the table stand generals and intelligence officers, their faces illuminated by the glow of desk lamps. They speak quietly, pointing to coded marks that indicate enemy strongholds. Each adjustment, each decision, is a movement in a game already visualized through months of planning. Outside, the storm of war rages, but inside that room, order and clarity reign. That calm precision, born of secret maps, is what would eventually turn the tide. Beyond the tactical realm, these maps carried a psychological impact that rippled across the ranks. Soldiers who had once felt lost or overwhelmed began to trust that they were part of something larger, something organized and intelligent. The belief that their commanders could see the whole picture gave them confidence. To many, the maps became symbols of progress, proof that the Allies were no longer on the defensive. The war that once felt chaotic and unpredictable now seemed guided by purpose. That psychological shift, from fear to faith, was as powerful as any weapon. The Axis powers, meanwhile, began to unravel under the weight of this new precision. Their commanders could not understand how the Allies seemed to anticipate every move. Convoys that should have been safe were ambushed. Airfields once hidden in remote regions were bombed with deadly accuracy. The Axis reliance on speed and surprise was crumbling. The Allies had found a way to strip away their mystery. The war was no longer a contest of reaction, but one of anticipation, and the Axis were perpetually one step behind. Yet these advancements came with their own burdens. The more complex the intelligence system grew, the more it demanded secrecy and discipline. A single captured map could compromise an entire operation. Cartographers and analysts lived with the constant tension of knowing that one mistake could cost hundreds of lives. The walls of their workrooms were lined with reminders. Accuracy saves lives. For them, the war was fought in silence, without glory or medals, yet their contribution resonated across every front. By 1945, as Allied forces closed in on Berlin and the Pacific campaigns reached their climaxes, the effects of this cartographic revolution were undeniable. The secret maps had not just guided armies, they had redefined how wars were conceived. The notion of total warfare, where every resource, every discipline, and every mind contributed, had taken full form. Geography had become intelligence, and intelligence had become victory. What began as an experiment had matured into a doctrine, one that would shape not only the final outcome of World War II, but the nature of military planning for generations to come. In the end, these maps represented more than tactical success. They were the physical embodiment of collaboration, intellect, and perseverance in a world consumed by destruction. They proved that even in an age dominated by weapons and machines, knowledge remained humanity's most powerful tool. Long after the guns fell silent, their legacy would continue, reshaping not only how wars were fought, but how peace was planned. For the Allies, the maps had not merely charted the land, they had charted the path to victory. By the spring of 1944, the maps that had once been confined to shadowed officers were now guiding the most ambitious military operations in human history. The Allies stood on the brink of a turning point. Every decision, every movement, every heartbeat of the war now depended on what those maps revealed. From the sands of Italy to the jungles of the Pacific, and from the skies above Berlin to the beaches of Normandy, the cartographic network that America had built began to fulfill its ultimate purpose. The time for theory was over. The maps were no longer silent. They were speaking through the roar of engines and the march of armies. In the early hours of June 6, 1944, the invasion of Normandy began. The operation, known as D-Day, was a masterpiece of coordination, relying entirely on intelligence and topography that had been prepared for years. The maps guiding the assault were unlike any in military history. They depicted not only the beaches and cliffs of northern France, but also the tides, sand density, and even the expected resistance based on intercepted German communications. Thousands of copies were printed in absolute secrecy, distributed to officers in sealed packets just days before the attack. For many soldiers, these maps were their last link to the unseen minds who had planned their fate. Imagine standing in the landing craft as it pitches violently in the churning sea. Around you, the sound of gunfire grows louder with every second. Water sprays into your face, stinging your eyes. In your hand, a laminated map shows a narrow corridor through which your unit must advance once ashore. It marks machine gun nests, cliffs, and safe routes up the beach. You clutch it tightly as the ramp drops, and the chaos explodes. In that moment, amid smoke and confusion, the map becomes your lifeline. The knowledge it carries is your only guide through the storm. Behind the scenes, the men and women who had drawn those maps waited in anxious silence. In underground rooms, from London to Washington, they listened to radio reports, tracing each phase of the invasion on massive wall charts. Every update confirmed whether their work had been right or fatally wrong. They had measured the tide patterns, studied the terrain from thousands of reconnaissance photos, and calculated distances to the meter. Now, their predictions were being tested by fire. When news finally came that Allied forces had broken through, the cheers that erupted in those secret offices were filled with relief and disbelief. Their ink, their numbers, had helped open the door to Europe. In the Pacific, the maps played an equally critical role. As American forces advanced island by island, each landing was preceded by intense study of topography and enemy fortifications. The battles of Saipan, Leyte, and Iwo Jima were guided by maps so detailed they included underwater reefs, jungle clearings, and volcanic slopes. Pilots used aerial charts to approach targets through blind clouds and storms, while naval commanders used coded sea maps to evade Japanese radar. Each victory was proof of the same principle. Knowledge had become the new artillery. It struck first, silently, long before the first shell exploded. As the Allies closed in on Germany, the maps became even more complex and indispensable. They charted railways carrying supplies to the Eastern Front, fuel depots hidden in forests, and secret routes used by retreating troops. When Allied bombers struck those targets with devastating accuracy, German commanders were stunned. They believed the Allies possessed some unknown technology that allowed them to see through the Earth itself. In truth, it was the work of tireless analysts and mapmakers who had studied every photograph, every intercepted report, until the enemy's secrets lay exposed on paper. The climax of this cartographic war reached its emotional height not in a single battle, but in a realization, a quiet acknowledgement among soldiers and commanders alike that they were witnessing a new kind of warfare. The old world of instinct and guesswork had been replaced by something far more deliberate. Wars were now planned with precision that touched every level of combat, from the general to the foot soldier. The power once held by generals on horseback now rested in the hands of unseen cartographers, whose work had redrawn the limits of what was possible. As victory drew nearer, the irony deepened. The maps that had guided men through fire and fear were already being replaced with newer versions, constantly updated to reflect the changing front. They were living documents, as fluid as the war itself. Yet their importance could not be overstated. They were the silent pulse beneath every mission, the invisible architecture of triumph. The war's great turning points, the liberation of France, the fall of Berlin, the victories across the Pacific were all bound together by a single thread of knowledge. In those final months, the maps had done more than guide armies. They had defined destiny. And so, as the Axis powers crumbled, the world began to grasp the magnitude of what had been accomplished. The Allies had not simply outfought their enemies. They had outthought them. The maps, born of secrecy and science, had carried humanity through its darkest storm. They proved that victory could be engineered through intellect as much as through courage. The true climax of World War II was not only fought on the beaches or in the skies, but also traced quietly in pencil long before the battles began. When the final guns of World War II fell silent, the world was left in ruins, but also in revelation. The same maps that had guided armies to victory were now stored away in locked cabinets, their edges frayed from use, their surfaces smudged with fingerprints of the men and women who had handled them. For years they remained classified, hidden from public view. Yet within their faded lines lay the story of how intelligence and imagination had reshaped warfare. To those who had lived through the chaos, it was clear. The pen and compass had proven as decisive as the tank and the rifle. The art of war had changed forever. In the months after the surrender, teams of historians and analysts began collecting the cartographic records scattered across Allied command posts. What they found was astonishing. Thousands of secret maps, each one a fragment of the world as seen through the eyes of war, filled warehouses and military archives. Some depicted entire continents with breathtaking precision. Others showed small patches of jungle, roads, or coastlines that had determined the fate of hundreds. Together, they formed a mosaic of human effort, a record of how knowledge had been wielded as a weapon. These maps became not only evidence of victory, but also a testament to cooperation, ingenuity, and sacrifice. For the mapmakers themselves, peace brought both relief and reflection. Many of them returned to universities or quiet government posts, their wartime contributions remaining unspoken for decades. Some could never forget the weight of responsibility they had carried. They had drawn the lines that sent men into battle, knowing that one mistake could mean disaster. Yet, they also understood that their work had saved countless lives. When asked years later how they endured the pressure, one former cartographer simply replied, "We had to believe the truth of the map could bring our boys home." It was a faith that had guided them through the war's darkest days. The legacy of those secret maps did not end with the victory parades. Their precision and methodology laid the groundwork for the Cold War intelligence systems that would follow. Satellite reconnaissance, aerial photography, and eventually digital mapping all trace their lineage to the innovations born in those wartime offices. The collaboration between scientists and soldiers, once seen as unconventional, became the standard model for modern defense strategy. Even in peacetime, nations continued to study the geography of potential conflict zones, preparing for threats that might never come. The lessons of World War II had been learned. Ignorance was no longer an option. Beyond the military sphere, the influence of wartime mapping quietly transformed civilian life. The same technologies that once guided bombers to their targets later helped planes cross oceans safely, guided ships through stormy seas, and charted unexplored regions of the world. Roads were built, cities expanded, and borders were redrawn, all using techniques perfected in the crucible of war. In classrooms and laboratories, young geographers studied these wartime maps with awe, not as symbols of destruction, but as monuments to human resilience. They saw in them a reminder that knowledge, when used wisely, could rebuild as well as destroy. Imagine one of those maps today, preserved behind glass in a museum. Its colors have faded, and the paper has yellowed with age, yet every line still speaks. You can trace the coastline of Normandy or the scattered islands of the Pacific and feel the weight of history pressing through the ink. Each contour, each mark, represents not just land, but lives, millions of them, caught in the tide of a global conflict. The map itself has become a relic, not of war's glory, but of its humanity, It is a silent voice whispering that understanding the world is the first step toward protecting it. In the end, the story of the 5 secret maps is not just about victory, but about transformation. They proved that intelligence, creativity, and courage could shape the course of history more profoundly than brute strength. They were the hidden allies of every soldier who marched, every pilot who flew, every sailor who navigated uncertain waters. Long after the battles ended, their influence continued to ripple through time, reminding future generations that foresight is the truest form of power. The maps may have been drawn in secret, but their legacy is written across the world we live in today. As the camera pans across the faded documents, the narrator's voice fades into silence. The music swells softly, echoing the heartbeat of a world forever changed. In the war rooms, the deserts, and the skies, the maps had spoken, and the world had listened. They were not merely instruments of war, but instruments of understanding. And in that understanding, humanity found not only victory, but vision. The secret maps of World War II had redrawn more than territories. They had redrawn the future itself.